Okay, so this is a presentation for anatomy and physiology describing the skeletal system of a dog. So I'm going to start off by talking about the head. So I will start off at the maxilla, which is the upper part of the dog's jaw, and then you move down to the mandible, which is the lower part of the jaw. Then we continue up to the skull, which is one of the most important bones in the body because it protects the brain of the dog. And then we start at the atlas, which is attached to the skull, and it's the start of the cervical vertebrae of the spine. And then we move to the axis, which is attached to the second. It's just the second part of the cervical vertebrae, and this is what allows the atlas to rotate, allowing the head to move back and forward so it can see around itself. And then we carry on down the neck, as you can see, down the cervical vertebrae, and we finish with what it's a short name, is C7, and that's the last bone in the cervical vertebrae, and it attaches to the scapula. Cervical vertebrae are the thinnest and most delicate bones, which make up the structure of the neck, which is why the neck's quite fragile.
The main body is the largest part of the dog, and therefore holds some of the largest bones throughout the body. We have the spine, which runs all the way down the back, and this has two different types of vertebrae. The first, thoracic vertebrae, and the main function of this is to hold up the rib cage. Secondly, we have lumbar vertebrae, and the main function of this is to bear weight of the body, so these vertebrae are bigger than the thoracic vertebrae. We also have the rib cage, which consists of 13 pairs, so 26 ribs in total, and these serve as vital protection for organs in the body such as the heart and lungs. We have the sternum, which is underneath the rib cage and has a caudal end, which is towards the tail, and a cranial end, and that is more protection for the vital organs. Toward the back end of the dog, there is the sacrum. And the sacrum has 5 vertebrae which are fused together, and they act as connective vertebrae to attach the spine to the pelvis. The coccygeal is also located after the sacrum, and many tendons, ligament and muscles connect to this. There's also a scapula, which acts as a shoulder blade in the dog and helps aid movement. We also have a pelvis. This helps to aid movement as well as processes such as running, walking and sitting.
The limbs of a dog are an important part of its skeletal structure as they allow the animal to move freely in its environment. As you can see, both the hind limbs and the forelimbs contain a similar distribution of both long and short bones. In the forelimbs we have the humerus. This is followed by the olecranon, otherwise known as the elbow. This then connects to the radius, the ulna, the carpal bones, which are smaller bones allowing for greater movement, then larger metacarpal bones, and finally the phalanges. Similarly, in the hind limbs we have a long bone, the femur. This then connects to the patella, otherwise known as the kneecap. Then we have the tibia and fibula, the calcaneus, which is the point of the hock, smaller tarsal bones, then metatarsal bones, and finally phalanges again. Smaller bones such as carpal or tarsal or phalanges allow for a greater degree of flexibility, whereas long bones work with skeletal muscles to provide the main movement for the dog.
Okay, I'm going to talk about short bones, which all have equal dimensions, and their purpose is that they absorb concussion when there's an impact to the bone. They're intended for strength and compactness, but they do have limited movement. They have an outer layer of compact bone with a core of cancellous bone, or you could call it spongy bone tissue. They have no medullary cavity where like red and yellow bone marrow is stored. And an example of a short bone is the ankle bone of the animal. So you can see we've got the phalanges here, which is basically the toes of the animal, and these are what we would call short bones. I will now talk about irregular bones, which have a similar structure to short bones but are just more oddly shaped. So what they do is that they protect nervous tissue, and they give support to the trachea. An example of a irregular bone is here, which is part of the vertebrate column. As you can see, they are short, but they are an odd shape.
Compact or cortical bone is a hard, dense bone tissue that covers the outer layer of all bones. It contains many microscopic eversion canals, so has a spongy appearance. Eversion canals give a blood supply to the osteocytes, the main type of bone cell. Osteocytes are arranged in a circular pattern around these eversion canals and appear to be isolated but are connected by thin cellular extensions. This allows for diffusion between the cells to occur. Therefore, cells closest to the eversion canals can pass back nutrients to further away cells, and cells further away can pass forward waste products to the blood supply in the eversion canals to expel. This is in order to allow cells to perform their specialised tasks.
As well as those types of bones, there are also long bones, and these get their names because they are longer than they are wide. These bones take most of the strenuous pressure throughout the day. Therefore, examples of these are bones such as the femur and tibia. Also, there are flat bones. These are bones such as the ribs and sternum, are an example of and the main purpose is protection or muscle attachment onto broad surfaces. We also have peristotum bone tissue. And peristotum bone tissue is a dense, irregular connective tissue, and it is located on the exterior of bones and has two different layers. The first is called the osteogenic layer. This layer contains mainly stem cells, and these help to make up the hard part of the bone. The second layer is called the fibrous layer, and this is made of dense, irregular connective tissue containing strong collagen fibre of the ligament and other things that connect to the bone.
I'm now going to talk about spongy bone tissue, of which consists of an internal meshwork of bony struts with interconnected spaces between, which are filled with red bone marrow. They're usually found at the end of long bones and in short, irregular flat bones there in the core. Found in most areas of bone that aren't put under any mechanical stress, and they're surrounded by a shell of compact bone, which gives the bone its strength. The major components, it's in like the ribs, the shoulders, and the skull. Its open structure allows it to dampen any sudden stress, like the impact. As you can see in this photo, as I said before, you have your yellow bone marrow, and all this pinky bit is the compact bone, the spongy bone, sorry. And this is what it looks like up close in the microscope.
The cardiac muscle is a muscle which is under involuntary or unconscious control. This means that the animal does not have to think about the muscle in order for it to work. The cardiac muscle has a striated cylindrical appearance and is only located in the myocardium, the muscular wall of the heart. The myocardium has two membranes, the epicardium on the outer layer of the muscle and the endocardium on the inner layer. The myofibers, or muscle cells, within the cardiac muscle are branched and contain many more mitochondria than skeletal muscles. This is due to the greater amount of power needed for the contraction of the heart. The cardiac muscle also contains intercalated discs, in which one cell contracts an electrical signal that is immediately passes on to the next cell, that passes it on to the next cell, and so on. This is in order for the cardiac muscle to respond rapidly to the constantly changing needs of the body.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about smooth muscle, which is an unstriated muscle and is involuntary, meaning that you can't control it, it's just something that happens. So, for example, you have your digestive tract, the bladder or the uterus. If we use the digestive tract as an example, it's responsible for moving the food through the digestive system, because if the food won't move, it would just sit there. It's controlled by an autonomic nervous system, and the cells of the smooth muscle are long and spindly shaped, like this, as you can see in the diagram. It's surrounded by small amounts of connective tissues that all bind the cells into sheets, like you can see here. The nucleus in each cell lies in its centre, and it does not appear striped. As you can see, it's quite wavy, and you can see these nuclei. exercise.
Another type of joint is cartilaginous joint. These allow limited movement or no movement at all and are united by cartilage. An example of this joint is between the two bones of the mandible and the maxilla. This joint is called mandibular symphysis. However, some cartilaginous joints are classed as amorphosis. This means that they allow some degree of movement between the bones. An example of this is the joints between each vertebrae.
Fibrous joints are held together by fibrous or cartilaginous connective tissue. There are three types of fibrous joint, the first being suture joints. This is where bones are separated by a thin layer of fibrous tissue. An example of this would be the skull. It becomes ossified in adults and has an irregular shape. Suture joints have no movement. They are synarthrotic. The second is syndesmosis joint. This is where bones are united by dense fibrous tissue, an example being the ends of the tibia and fibula. Here there are slight movements. They are amphiarthrotic. The final fibrous joint is gomphosis. This is where the bone is cone-shaped, like a peg in a socket. These have no movement and are synarthrotic. The only example of this is the connection between the teeth in the mandible and maxilla.
The synovial joints are held together by presence of an articular capsule, which is composed of dense, irregular connective tissue and ligaments. The key structures within a synovial joint is synovial cavity, which is the space between the articulating bones of a synovial joint, and the purpose is to allow the joint to move freely without any stiffness. Then you have synovial fluid, which is usually viscous and like a clear pale or like yellow colour. It's composed of hyaluronic acid, which is secreted by the synovial membrane, and interstitial fluid, which is then filtered by the blood plasma. Then there's the articular capsule, which is a connective tissue capsule which encloses the synovial cavity and the articulating structures. It's composed of two layers, so you have the inner layer, which is synovial membrane, and then the outer layer is simply dense irregular connective tissue. And then you have your articular cartilage, which are articulating surfaces of bones which are covered into a 1 to 5 millimeter layer of hyaline cartilage, which is referred to as the articular cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is smooth to enable minimal friction between articulating bones, whilst providing a key mechanical structure which absorbs the shock. And this minimises concussive forces of locomotion. And this diagram, as you can see, this is the articulative cartilage, and the synovial membrane, and the articular capsule. It has the joint, because it's very complex, it has different ways of moving. So you have gliding, which is just simply moving from side to side or forward to backwards. You have flexion, which is a decrease in the joint angle, so like this. And then you have extension, which is the opposite of flexion, like that. Sometimes may hyperextend go beyond its normal anatomical position, so whereas if it should go like this, it would bend backwards instead and go too far. You then have adduction, which is movement of a joint towards the midline of the body. For example, the shoulder to the hip joint of the dog. You then have abduction, which is opposite of adduction axis, where rotation occurs in the limb. It may be described as medial or lateral rotation.